We are excited to have all of you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are recording our session today, so to save on bandwidth, we do ask that everyone mute themselves and turn off their camera unless they are one of the presenters. If you, since we are recording, if you would like to have don't want your name on the recording, please just message Nancy Heron. She's running tech for us today, so she can go ahead and make sure she's got you on attendance. Thank you, Nancy, for running tech for us today. We really appreciate it. With our recording, Alice will be sending out a follow-up email in the coming days with the recording, so please feel free to share that with anyone who is not here today. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such is on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. And in just a moment, I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat about land acknowledgements and about those people groups. I'd like to go ahead and start us today with our presentation from Valerie, Katie, and Bonnie. They're going to be talking to us about school gardens. And to start us all off, I'm just going to let them introduce themselves. And I'm going to turn my camera off.
Hi, I am Katie Nika, and we all work for University of Texas at Austin. We work in something called the Eden Lab, which is run by Dr. Jamie Davis in the Department of Nutrition. And we really work to help teachers promote learning through and healthier living through hands-on experiences in schools. So we mainly work with garden and nutrition education, helping teachers adapt their curriculum and create a fun learning environment in their school gardens. So it's nice to have y'all here, and we're excited to be talking to you.
All right, I'll jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm Bonnie Martin. I am lucky enough to be working in the Eden Lab with these amazing ladies right here. I started my journey with the Eden Lab when we were doing a program called Texas Sprouts, which was an amazing evaluation project about how gardens affect nutrition and eating habits of elementary age kids. So that was just a really fun way to get involved with nutrition, school gardens. I actually have a history going back with school gardens probably about 20 years now, where I've done design work and program work for individual schools and helping them to start and establish and sustain their school gardens.
Okay, I'm Valerie Cordes, and I have worked with Eden Labs for 3 years now, and it's been an amazing journey teaching teachers how to use the outdoor classroom and especially their gardens as a teaching tool and not just like a special occasion thing. I have been a teacher and a special ed teacher for 20 years, and so that's the background I bring.
Well, thank you so much, y'all, for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and start our questions. If any of the participants have any follow-up questions while we're going through these, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will relay them to our presenters. So our first one is, do you have any recommended steps or processes for schools to follow in order to establish a school garden?
I'll go ahead and start off with this question. So one of the things that we do in the Eden Lab is we have a program called Sprouting Teachers. And Katie and Valerie and I are all coaches in that program, where we work individually with teachers and as well with garden leadership committees to coach them on best practices for gardens and how to integrate their school garden into their curriculum, into their classroom curriculum. So working with garden leadership committees, we've had a lot of practice on talking to them about, what are kind of like the basic steps for success. I would say that kind of divides into two things. One is the planning process. A lot of schools are just like, if we build a garden, like it's all going to fall into place. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. So with planning, sitting down and planning and really establishing some goals with a good team that includes an admin representative, has some representation from teachers, from your community, maybe even facilities at your school district. Then sitting down and thinking about, what are your goals for the garden? where you're going to get your funding. Really important is like your expectations for use, because that allows you to kind of shape your actions around reaching what your expectations are and making sure you have support. We always tell our garden committees, the garden committee is not, you don't get on the garden committee and get assigned a weed. Like that's not your job as the garden committee. Your job is to figure out who's going to be doing the weeding. So it's like a, really a steering committee for the garden. The second part of my answer is about design. And I don't necessarily mean the physical design of the actual garden, although that is important. You want to think about, why do you put every element in? It has to be towards your goals. But really, you want to also think about the design of the entire program. So you're designing the program around making sure maintenance happens. You're designing your program around making sure teachers want to go out and taking away those obstacles. So it all goes back to planning, but really thinking about your garden needs to help reach your goals in the way that you design it and in the way that you design your program.
Wonderful. With that in mind, are there any best practices or specific recommendations for elements to include in your school garden?
I'll take that question. What we really like to talk to garden teams about, or someone wanting to start a garden, is really to look at what your goals are. So start at the end and kind of work backwards from where you want to be. And that helps you think about really where you should start. So do you want to have a teaching space? Are you looking at putting an outdoor classroom with, seating and a dry erase board, a shade cover, a place for, kids to be and students to sit and teachers to be able to teach comfortably? Are you looking for something that's more nutrition focused, or something more for like SEL, sensory, something that you can, put vegetables in? Do you want herbs? Do you want native plants to do life cycles and insects? What kind of things are you looking to have? Do you want to be attracting a lot of birds and insects? Or are you specifically just going to be doing an edible garden? There's also, thinking about what you would want students to be doing out there, or people to be doing out there. Are you going to have space for like interactions? Are you going to be holding events out there? Is it just going to be specifically for curriculum use and students, and using that space for something when if you're at a school's not in session, or you don't have students there, is something good to kind of think about, like other ways in which you would maybe use that space. And a big thing to always think about is maintenance, because that's obviously huge in a garden space. You need storage for tools, potentially drip lines, all your other equipment and supplies, hoses, all those kind of things need a space to be and to live, especially if you're in an open area where you want to lock it up, or just so they're not sort of floating in space. And then having a system for that is something we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's, important to think through too, is how you're gonna make all that happen.
With that in mind, we have had quite a few of our partners have a problem with maintenance staff on the ISD level, so not necessarily the school itself, mowing their gardens. And so what have you seen is a good policy to kind of help that not happen?
We were just talking about this, actually.
We literally just had this conversation. I think every school that we've been to in the past couple of weeks, I've been like, oh my God, what's happening with the grass, like seeding into and they've put in work orders and things like that. Most people, they kind of start with putting a work order into facilities, but facilities is really shorthanded right now. Some of the schools have resorted to having their own little weed whacker or push mower that they can kind of at least get the edges of the area. And sometimes it's just being patient. It's really, I don't know, it's a tough time right now. It's like we got a ton of rain and everything just went out of control. Anything else you guys would add? Any other suggestions?
Having kids go along the border and pull that up,
Yeah.
Bermuda grass.
Get your kids out there and
Yeah, and even if it's not quality weeding, like they love doing it. They love pulling anything up. So to say like, hey, anything, along the edge, pull it up, like let them have a contest pulling up. At least like
Yeah.
it's seeds out of the way.
Who can make the biggest
Yeah.
pile? Yeah.
Right? Who can make the biggest pile? How many can you count?
Yeah.
Just make a game out of it.
And then we have a question in the chat. How do you get school teachers and administrators involved when they are stretched so thin and not getting paid for many things after hours already?
Valerie, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. You would have to, like, I think the first thing you would do is sell your administrator on why we have a school garden and why it's important. At Davis Labs, we've done some research about the interactions with children and nature, and especially the garden and nutrition and their outcomes. A lot of positive outcomes for both students and teachers being outside for parts of the day. So I think the first thing is convincing your administrator that this is a good idea and we do need to support that. And I think for teachers, the main thing is to try to keep everything within school hours. Don't ask teachers to come on the weekends or, weed after school or anything like that, because I'm a teacher. It's just very unappealing. It's like, really? One more thing. So I'd say keeping it everything within the school hours, and then having maintenance days be part of the community, parents, outside help for those kind of events. And then the regular things would be like, if there's maintenance tasks, you take your students out there for 10 minutes and you do 10 minutes worth of weeding, and then you're done with that. Things like that help a lot and make it seem less overwhelming. And then helping teachers see the garden as a regular part of the curriculum rather than a special event thing or something that you put curriculum on them and you say, here, you have to do this, because no one has time for that in their day. So I think that would be the main ways I would, sort of get buy-in from teachers and administrators, and just make it fun. Leave produce on the principal's desk, put some flowers in the front office, and just sort of, put a little sign there. This is from the garden. This is what we're harvesting in the garden right now. Things like that. That helps a lot.
Thanks, Valerie.
That's a good question.
We do have another question in the chat. How do you get the guidelines for use to teachers, and do you have good examples of some?
I think, this is always of course, going to be kind of individual for every school. And one of the main things that we start with is talking to garden committees about, it's really important to have a school garden be more of a yes garden than a no garden. You don't want to start by constantly telling the kids what they can't do in the garden, because then they just think they're just not allowed to touch anything. And so one of the things that we talk to our teachers about is starting with sort of a garden expectations lesson with their classroom. And really like establishing as a group, as a class, like what are the expectations, that, is this a place where we run around? Is it similar to the playground? Kids can sometimes be confused about, because it's an outdoor space. So that helps teachers kind of feel like, because I know we have teachers who say, I don't want to be the class that goes out there and is like kids pulling plants out, and so they're kind of afraid to go out there. So once they establish those expectations, I think that's good. But I think it's also really important for the garden committee to establish some messaging and have some training for teachers, especially new teachers coming in, but even like teachers that have been there for years, just have something that kind of says, what is the garden all about? Do they need to sign up to use it? Can they go out anytime? What supplies are out there? And I think that really helps to, like give them a sense of what that's about. This constantly happens where gardens are sort of characterized as somebody else's garden, right? So like, if a teacher's out there a bunch and she's the one that started it, oh, it's Miss Jones' garden, so I didn't know I could do that. Or it's the person who constantly takes care of it. So it's really important for schools to know, like, it's everyone's garden, and here are, hey, we don't pick without permission, but there's going to be times that we can pick. And so having some positivity with it.
With that in mind, have you had any success working with PE teachers using the garden for physical exercise, especially now with PE being required daily?
I'm working with a PE teacher right now, and she's combining, the nutrition peaks, and they have sort of alternate PE for students who aren't into traditional sports. So they'll have, they'll have a hike around, and then they'll pull weeds or they'll plant things, and that will count as some physical activities. It's kind of nice for kids who aren't competitive or aren't into the sports. So she uses that as sort of like a way to be more inclusive. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. But yeah, we do have some PE teachers that are interested in using the garden as sort of an alternate PE form. This is another way you can get outside. It's not all sports and competition.
And it doesn't even really have to be like doing something physically with the plants. For example, like we have a lot of times we'll talk to teachers about maybe just starting their day outside with their class, doing like a couple of yoga poses in the garden, or doing like a sound mapping opportunity where the kids are just listening for things. And so again, that could tie into PE, where they sort of like start in the garden and do a couple of like garden inspired yoga poses, and then, go and do another activity and then come back later. And maybe weeding is a part of it, where they're talking about like body positions and doing things like that.
We have a question here from Debbie. She says, I'm a STEM school teacher with very little green space, mostly concrete all around. Any ideas for bringing green space to the concrete area? Raised beds, yes, but any other creative thoughts?
I mean, raised beds, of course, is like kind of the immediate thing. And there's lots of things you can do with like kind of atypical raised beds. You can do like kind of like succulent gardens with like stacked either PVC pipes, or, you've seen probably a lot of schools, like it was kind of in vogue to do like the little tire beds kind of things. What else? Master Gardeners has a great like grow box design that's really wonderful and is like super efficient at using at being watered. So that's something you could look up. You can just look up grow box design for that.
I know Whole Foods right now is promoting their what do they call it, farm stand, and it's a hydroponic lettuce tower. And it's a tower, and you poke the lettuce in, and it has, the feed system goes through, and it's a chemistry lesson and a biology lesson. And so it's pretty interesting, and you can just set it up on the concrete. You just need you need electricity. So there are things like that as well. Some sort of new thinking about gardening without soil.
And like maybe even like a mini greenhouse type situation. Could be cool too. Have some reclaimed materials.
And I would also put in there, just like if you have like kind of projects like this that you have in mind, I'll put a plug in for like Eagle Scouts are always looking for like projects like this where they can really work with an organization, and they do the fundraising for it and everything like that. So you have to work with the Eagle Scout and spend that time to like make sure the design is to your liking, or they understand, because they're teenagers. But anyway, but they're just such an amazing resource for projects like this.
And some people have amazing results with hay bales. I've never done a hay bale garden myself, but some people have really great results with it, and it doesn't take a lot of soil, and you can pretty much put it anywhere.
Yeah, there was a guy who did a whole garden in the bed of his truck. Like he would just throw out like in bags of like garden soil and then split it open and then do the seeds, and he would drive around town with like a garden in the bed of his truck. So awesome. If he can do that, I think we can do something on concrete.
And thanks to everyone in the chat who's been giving Debbie some suggestions. We do have a question here. Can you give an example of a great raised bed that lasts?
Ooh, okay, raised beds. So yeah, so there's a lot of options. So, obviously, like a lot of people will build them out of wood, and you start having rotting and you start having warping. We found when we did the Texas Sprouts Gardens, we were building gardens in 16 schools, and we did cinder blocks, which I know cinder blocks are like not sexy or anything like that, but they're very stable. They're not very expensive. And we really loved the aspect of having that hole in the top of the cinder blocks, when you use them sideways, where we could plant little crops around the edges, like companion planting with marigolds, or doing like lettuce or like radishes, some of those smaller crops. So that's a lot of fun. I mean, obviously, if you go more expensive, you can do like different types of like rocks and things like that, or like, you know, even like cut limestone. But, you know, and then Home Depot also has more like, if you want to do something that's a little more curvy, they have those like kind of stackable rocks that are sort of allow for a better curve than cinder blocks would. But I kind of go back to like really sticking with some, you know, masonry, some type of a stone or block if you really want sustainability in there.
I've seen some people use too that like wood plastic composite,
Mhm.
which is like, I don't even know that it's cheaper than cinder blocks, honestly, but I know that's, I have heard some of the like pre-K teachers being like, oh, that's really dangerous for kids, which, you know, yes, if they trip and hit their head on a cinder block, that's going to be bad news. But
Mhm.
I mean, if they trip and hit their head on anything, it's gonna hurt. So,
Yeah.
and then I've seen too, the like, it's like metal, I don't know if it's steel, but some of that using that, which is a similar kind of idea to cinder block because it's, I mean, like you said, metal.
And just
Yeah.
remember, anything metal you're going to have, it's going to hold a lot of heat. And, you know, Texas, like if you're in Texas, we deal with brutal sun. And so those kind of plastic materials, a lot of times can start to get very brittle. And that's where we start dealing with like kind of the maintenance of it and whether like pieces break off or anything like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've seen people use the water troughs as well. That you
Oh, yeah.
farm store.
Yeah, just Chris
Yeah,
has
that's what I was
like galvanized metal beds.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, the like, yeah. Yeah, that would be toasty in the summer.
So y'all alluded a couple of minutes ago to curricula that you use with teachers out there. Are there any specific curriculum that you would encourage that you use to encourage outdoor learning with different age levels?
I'll go ahead and take that one. No, we don't have a specific curriculum that we give out. I think it's more organic and sustainable, because if you give out a curriculum and say, here you go, teach this, then that's sort of the end of it. That's the beginning of the end, and it doesn't allow you to like do cross-curricular activities as much and sort of really get it into your day and make it part of your long-term curriculum. That kind of like set curriculum tends not to last a long time. It tends to like a year or two, and then it kind of fades away. So what we do with teachers is to talk to them about what they're teaching now, what their current curriculum is, and then as coaches, we talk to them about, okay, how could we amend this? How could we take some of this and take it outside? And it can be like super simple things, SEL lessons, where you go outside and, like Bonnie was saying earlier, we sit for a minute and we do sound mapping. Or we go outside and we look for textures. We just take a little walk through the garden to, you know, clear our heads and get into some green space. It can be super simple things like that if people are a little hesitant. Or you can do, you know, there's just so many things. It's all outside. There's math, measuring shapes, geometry. You can do ELA out there with reports. You can do reports on animals and trees and environment and biodiversity. And so you can weave it into your current curriculum so it becomes more of a part of your curriculum rather than sort of a separate thing that you just do sometimes. And that's our goal when we go out as coaches for sprouting teachers, because we find it lasts longer and is more impactful. And just like making it a regular part, like every week we go out in the garden and do STEM activities. Every week we go out and do some math, you know, just making it a regular part of it is really more effective.
Yeah, agreed. Like Friday journaling in the garden, or Monday story time in the garden, or right. It doesn't have to be like this formal lesson. It doesn't have to be 45 minutes, right? It can be like, you know, short, long, you know, social emotional learning. It could just be like, let's go and look for the next character in our story that we're going to write out in the garden. And that's just the space that you use.
Thanks. We've got a question in the chat. Bonnie mentioned a garden committee as part of this process. Is this something that a school should form, and who would serve on this committee? And can you give an example of what the committee does / how it functions?
Yes. Is it okay if I take this, ladies?
Yeah.
Okay, we're huge garden committee fans. We just think, the garden committee is a great first step. So this is a school garden. So really having somebody else come in and run it, or have one teacher run it, it just tends to be it may work for a couple of years, but it doesn't kind of work in the long run. The school needs to know that the garden is a part of its community. So anyway, garden committee, yes, you should form it. The people you should have on that committee, first of all, you just want people who want to be on the committee. Nobody wants people who are like, oh, you have to go to another committee meeting, which, I know we all feel that way, but usually you can find those people who are kind of passionate. We advocate having a representative from admin, because there's always those big questions that you just need to have some communication with admin where they can say, yes, this is what we can do. You need to have teacher representation. Some schools choose to have a teacher from every grade level on there. Some schools, they're like, hey, we at least want 3 teachers, and you'll find those teachers who are just they're really into the garden. And then I think it depends on from there what your community is like. So if you have really strong parent involvement in the garden, we really think it's a great idea to have a PTA representative, because a lot of times there's some funding issues that you might need to talk about, or just even getting the word out to parents about work days and stuff like that. And then it just depends, you might have, some facilities people, you might have a custodian on there. We know one school who had their custodian loved their garden and loved coming up to water it, and he was a great person to have on their committee. So anyway, just having some different stakeholders on there is important. And then in terms of functions, it's really important for that committee to kind of establish some roles. So always having one person who's just going to be the committee chair to make sure the committee keeps meeting, whether it's monthly, whether it's every 8 or 9 weeks, just sending out those notices. Having the other areas that we kind of advocate having roles for, or having one person who's the maintenance chair. And I'm going to say that and very quickly follow up by saying that's not the person who does the maintenance. That's the person who's going to talk about maintenance at the meeting. Maintenance needs, maintenance work days. How are we going to do this? Kind of bringing up that topic. Having one person who's the kind of secretary and can just take notes. And maybe you have one person who's, for example, the, teacher outreach person. So try to figure out what you feel like you want to accomplish as a committee, and make sure that you have people who take on those responsibilities as just kind of heading them up so that you can keep going with it. There's always going to be something with special events like planting, or maybe it's literacy night and you have a book reading in the garden or something. So you might have someone who's kind of heading that up too, and it helps to kind of spread the responsibility and not have one person feel like they've got a lot going on.
Great. There's a follow-up here. Does the garden committee also help with summer upkeep?
Yeah, last meeting of the year, that's usually April or May meeting. Usually when we're meeting with garden committees, that's the one where they take on the summer maintenance question. Again, they're not doing the maintenance, they're just figuring out the approach to doing it. And there's lots of different ways to approach that. But that committee kind of deciding it and putting into practice means it's actually going to happen.
Great. When you are thinking about designing the garden, what you're wanting to put in, what are some considerations that you think about for different age groups?
Sorry, can I take this again? And then I won't talk for 10 minutes. I think for different age groups, part of that early planning is thinking about things that are on teachers' minds. And the teacher's going to think about, do I feel safe out there with my kids? Do I feel like I can focus on my task without constantly looking over my shoulder and feel like I'm losing kids? And so, that's something where we actually talk with teachers when we're coaching them about like, what are their big obstacles? And so somebody might say like, I have a kid that wanders off. I have a kid that, is a little more maybe prone to like do something, very instinctual, like pull something out of the ground. So we'll start with the teachers with encouraging them to just like start where they're comfortable. So for those teachers that are worried about those things, we might just say, and this happens a lot with younger classes, like just walk your kids through the garden. Don't even stop, but just talk about things on the way and then come back to your classroom where you're feeling a little bit safer and talk about what you saw. You might even snap some pictures along the way. So that's great because it allows them to have that exposure, and then they can come back and talk about the garden. And then the kids are kind of set up for like wanting to go back through and have another experience. And slowly the teacher can like build that time up that she's taking the kids into the garden, and the kids get more used to it, So, and I would also say, just going back to that garden expectations, having that discussion with the kids about that.
Okay, and then, so my last question, so folks start putting some stuff in the chat so I can relay. Our last question that we have ready is there specialized training that maintenance or educators or the administration go through to help care for and maintain school gardens?
Yeah, I mean, there could be a training for that. You could do something, but I think really the gardening cycle is pretty much the same. I mean, I think particularly in Texas where, I mean, our weather is not totally predictable, but like the seasons per se are somewhat predictable in the way that the plants, when they're growing, when they're dying, when you're sort of changing over to the next season, it stays the same. Very small changes from year to year. So you kind of learn that cycle and know what you're looking at and what you're looking for and what you're tending towards as, the months and the days move on, then you kind of get the hang of it. So you can, one way would be to create like a record of what that cycle looks like for depending on what your use is of your garden. If you're doing, native plants might still be around, so you might not have to do a whole bunch of things. Some herbs sometimes stick around as well. But if you have annuals, edible plants, things like that, you are going to need to be switching those out, pulling them out, replanting ones that grow in the cool season versus ones that grow in the warm season. There's a really great list that we love to use from Texas A&M that shows, it's for Central Texas, but I think they have them for all the different regions of Texas. The planting season, what you plant when, it's a cool kind of visual thing you can look at for what months. And then, when you're planting the vegetables, obviously is really important. And then weeding, sometimes we get questions about weeds and what's a weed and what could just be maybe growing in my garden. I don't know. We actually have a little presentation I think that we could totally share with Sarah that has some pictures of typical weeds that you'll want to pull out versus something that you might think is a beautiful flower growing in your garden, which sometimes it's up to you.
Sometimes that happens.
Yeah, sometimes it happens. You don't know. But then, different if you have perennials planted, if you have a sensory bed and you want to prune those, like what should they look like? Google's a great place to look that up too. Finding your local master gardener group. They're an awesome resource for those kind of questions. And I think they love getting those questions. They still have a dedicated number, Bonnie, that you can call and ask gardening questions.
Yeah, they do still have, they have not only that, but they have an email that you can email and get a response.
Yeah, which is pretty great as well. We also suggested maybe you have like a virtual book of what things look like. So for your whatever program you have or for your school, you can have something in like a Google Doc that you have pictures of what the plants look like. Like this is what our plant looks like when it's doing well. This is what it looks like when it's bolting and like it needs to maybe be taken out soon. You can also have a calendar with tasks based on what month it is or what's coming up, or if there's someone with a really green thumb, they can, help you kind of see what that is. And then, you know, what Bonnie was talking about with the garden committee, they can really help you with the maintenance tasks to kind of figure out what makes sense and open that up to a bigger group. And there are apps. That is true. There are lots of apps that you can use.
App, we love the Seek app. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. And
Mhm.
but you
Yeah.
know, you don't want your garden committee to start from scratch every year. So that's why it's important to keep that, like, whatever you want to do, a Google folder where you can kind of like, you know, your agendas can live from past meetings, your planning for the community workday. Like community workdays, if you plan one, you've planned 10 million. So, you know, once you have those guidelines,
Mhm.
you can kind of record them down, and like, you know, the garden committee 3 years from now will benefit from that. So make sure you're kind of capturing that committee's work so that it lives on in future years.
Yeah.
We have a question about funding. So what are some sources of funding that you found? Are there any good grants for school gardens?
Oh yeah. Valerie or Katie? Yeah.
Let's see. You know, places that you would expect. Whole Foods, Sprouts, they give out regular grants. Big Green, there are definitely lists that you can just Google, you know, school garden grants, and we probably have a link that we could share later on.
Yeah.
And you know, it varies a lot as far as who's giving out how much money and when. Home Depot will do it sometimes and sometimes not. Yeah, that's a trickier one for sure. And there's a lot more money to establish your garden than there is to do any maintenance or updating in general.
Although I think those grants are getting better in terms of like grants to older gardens to be able to address some things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one thing I would recommend to people is, I mean, you know, like Valerie said, there's like lists, you can do searches and all this kind of stuff, but start out, again, it's almost like going back to the planning part of it, is make sure that you have a very clear write-up of what your garden is, what the goal is, and how it's unique, and have some data backing it up. So how many kids are using it, you know, how long has it been in existence, get some quotes from teachers. And if you have that, then whatever grant you get, which they all ask for slightly different things, all you have to do is really kind of cut and paste your verbiage into the grant. You don't have to rewrite it every time. So some schools choose to have like, hey, maybe there's a parent that's going to be the grant writer, or maybe it's just a teacher that's writing it, but like create kind of your vision statement first that you can grab from, so that filling out those grant paperwork is not such a big task every single time. And then keep track, again, keep a record of like who you applied to, when they'll be responding, and you know what you've won over the years. Like I saw Priscilla was saying, like she's won a bunch of things. Like, yeah, you want to be able to like celebrate that, but also all of this is part of the data of a garden. And one thing that working at the Eden Lab has taught me is how important data is. And so, you know, doing like, go ahead and do a survey at the end of every year to your teachers. Don't make it like, it ends up being like 50 questions. Maybe it's just 5, you know, maybe it's about, did you use the garden this year? You know, what was the best thing you thought about the garden? What's something you wish was improved about the garden? Do you plan to use it next year? You know, pick 5 questions and send it out. And that kind of data is going to help the garden committee shape their plan going forward to address concerns from the teachers.
Yep, we have a great survey that I would like to make a plug for. That is on our website. I can put it in the chat. That can help you kind of assess. It's really for school gardens and school garden programs, but you can take the survey and then it will shoot out a scorecard for you that tells you what you're doing really well in your program and what you could really use support with. And then we give you tips for support. So it's a good resource too.
Thanks. Any other questions out there? Feel free to put them in the chat. As y'all are doing that, Katie did put a nice resource for grants in the chat, and then also Texas Children in Nature tries to keep up with grants as well on our page. So feel free to check both of those resources out. And while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and give a plug for our summit. So Texas Children in Nature Network does a conference every year. It's going to be December 7 through 9, and we're going to be on UT's campus this year at the AT&T Conference Center. And so we are excited to see all of you there if you're able to join us. I'm putting the registration link in the chat. And as I was vamping, we got a question. So we work with joint use school parks, and they often have concerns with dogs. How have you managed dog issues in the gardens?
You know, I like the closest I've dealt with one where we had a lot of people like from the community coming over and like picking vegetables out of the garden. And so a lot of them, like the kids were like, what happened to our watermelon? You know, and so I don't know, we've kind of approached it with kindness of having like some signs up that just say, you know, we'd love for you to look at our produce, but please leave it for the kids to enjoy. And that might be something with, again, just with, you know, dog owners, like reminding them that the space is used by kids and that we really want to like protect it. So yeah, any other ideas on that one?
Just a big old fence, but
Yeah.
obviously that costs a lot of money and can be hard to do.
I just added something into the chat as well, which is like a little brain share that we've done before, where we ask like our teachers that are in our program to kind of share their ideas for like different, you know, lessons and approaches to things. So it's something that's like active, and we actually would love to have people add to it and add ideas or comment on things. So feel free to be an active member of that.
Thank you. And we'll be sure to add that into our follow-up email as well, so folks can have that link.
Great.
So I'm going to vamp for one more time and see if we get another question, because it worked so well last time. We also have an evaluation of today's webinar, so you could take a few moments to fill that out for us. We just talked about how much we all love having data. And so if y'all could fill that out for us, that really helps us, Alice and I, plan for future webinars.
Hey, Sarah, would you mind if I do just tell a little bit about Sprouting Teachers?
Go for it.
Yeah, so just so everyone here knows, if you have an interest in Sprouting Teachers, we do have our application period typically opens up in probably it's like early April, mid-April, something like that. And then we have schools apply. You can apply for 2 different tracks, either individual teacher coaching, which is where we work one-on-one with the teacher. And we like to work with multiple teachers at a school, so we feel like there's like some traction that's happening. Or the Garden Leadership Committee coaching, where we're actually working with the committee itself. Like I said, the application period typically opens in April. Decisions are usually given sometime in like maybe like June, late-ish June, sometime around there. And, you know, this year we're like thrilled to be working with multiple districts, you know, multiple schools. And we have schools that like are repeat customers for us, where they come back and they have different teachers go through it every year. I have a school that's been working in our program now for 4 years, and they've probably had, you know, like over 15 teachers go through getting coaching on this. So then you really start getting some traction there.
We did get another question come in. So safety is a big concern this year. How have you addressed keeping kids safe while gardening outdoors? And then they put in parentheses, specifically from an active shooter standpoint.
Yeah, I've had a couple of schools kind of talk about this in terms of just with their teachers establishing some policies. So some of them have asked their teachers, like, before you go outside to the garden, it kind of depends on the location of the garden, right? But like, before you go out to the garden, like just pick up a walkie-talkie from the office so that we have a communication channel with you. You know, some of it where especially there's like a kind of a courtyard, like an exposed courtyard, there's some worry about that. I don't know that there's a great answer, because there's just not really a great answer right now to the overall question of school safety. But really it's just more about, I think like ignoring the issue is not the answer. Like there needs to be a discussion with the teachers if they're concerned, then try to talk about like what would be you know, the approach if something like that happened. You know, it used to be that we would talk about like, well, what if it's a tornado or something like that? And now it's super sad that we're having to talk about, you know, active shooters and things like that. But go ahead and talk about that in the same way you would talk about where everyone is at the school. You just want to make sure there's an approach that everyone knows about.
Right. I think letting people know when you're going out, you know, when your class will be outside in the garden would be key. And then following the same procedures you do for things like when you go out to recess. It's a similar situation where you're just a little more exposed and you need to be aware.
I'm sorry that that is a concern. It's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, I wish I had we got another question. Good. I was like, I don't know if I want to end on that. So a question for any tips for the best plants to start with.
That's true. Herbs
Yeah.
for edible. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
And
love
herbs
herbs.
with so many buckets, like they check off so many boxes in terms of like sensory, culinary, you know, as well as being huge attractors for native insects. So, you know, fennel and dill and parsley for swallowtail butterflies. Oregano and basil are going to be huge for bees, and they're super hardy.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually a great suggestion. Schools are often like, we want to have a vegetable garden. And we always say like vegetable gardens are kind of like the fun, fancy part of gardening, but they're also the highest maintenance. They take the most supplies. So I often kind of lean back and say like, it's great to have kind of a mixture of stuff to have. If you're going to have a vegetable garden, that's great, but like have some herbs in there too, and then mix in some native stuff that's really going to last from year to year.
Mhm. Agreed.
And if you're in Central Texas, looking at the Grow Green guide for suggestions on native, you know, plants, local nurseries, you know, kind of looking at what has lasted, you know, what do they recommend in terms of hardiness?
So I'm going to close this out with one final question. For each of you, what is your favorite thing to do in the garden?
I'll go. I like planting because it's so fun and hopeful. It doesn't always turn out the way you imagine, which is an excellent learning opportunity. But yeah, I like putting the seeds in and then watching the show, you know, watching it day after day and see what happens. And the anticipation of, you know, the butterflies coming or the birds coming or that beautiful tomato.
I love all the different smells, at least right now. I'm probably changing all the time, but right now I feel like just the smells of the garden are so fun.
So my favorite thing with the school garden is I like to go like a half hour before I'm due to like do anything in the garden. And I like to just wander around for my own for like 30 minutes and try to really look at like, find some cool things, like find that there's aphids on the milkweed or find that there's swallowtail caterpillars. And I always like try to take some pictures so the ladies know that I'm always sending them like pictures, like, look at this, look at this. But the best moment is when a class comes out and maybe they're just walking through, but they're like, Miss Bonnie, what are you looking at? And when you like tell them there's this little thing and the teacher's like, oh my God, I never would have seen that. Like, I love that moment of like passing something on that they probably would have walked by if they just hadn't had the moment to like stop and look.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, all of you, for your time today. I really appreciate it. For everyone who's on the call, we will be sending out the link to the recording in the coming days. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for all your questions.
Yeah.